Oh, I have to do, I'm sorry, someone turned the light off, sorry.
That's okay. All right. Hi, everybody. So my name is Annie Gilson. I am the advisor of the creative writing program, which is part of the English department at Oakland University. I want to welcome our virtual audience to Earthlings and Aliens, OU's evening with Jeff VanderMeer. I want to thank Dean Corcoran of the College of Arts and Sciences, Cynthia Ferreira, Jeff Chapman and the Creative Writing Program, and Rob Anderson and the English Department for all their help. This is a time when we need to hear stories that can help us to feel part of a sane and conscientious community of readers and activists. So we appreciate OU's support of the arts and sciences by helping us to bring Jeff VanderMeer in virtually. We, the audience for this event, are most likely here because Jeff VanderMeer is a best-selling, award-winning author whose hypnotically weird fiction has the ability to mesmerize and terrify its readers and possibly change their DNA. We don't know what will become when we finish reading a piece of VanderMeer fiction, but we know it will be something alien and new. Some say VanderMeer himself is not human, but can take human form, while others say he was once human, but has now also transmogrified into something new. All this may be hearsay, but I have it on good authority that he is learning to speak raccoon. And though I can't say for sure that reading his work is tantamount to becoming infected by him, becoming a carrier of the VanderMeer contagion, I do know that reading him can cause low-grade fever, create paranoia, and cause us to experience the world as a surreal nightmare version of the normal world we used to think we lived in. Of course, having survived 2020, most of us no longer think that we live in that normal world, but with VanderMeer's help, perhaps we can start to ask questions about our species' notion of normalcy. Maybe we can even ask those questions without killing all the other species we share the earth with. In addition to being a challenging and engaging writer, VanderMeer is also an anthologist and editor who generously promotes the work of his fellow writers of fantasy, sci-fi, and weird fiction. He has been an accessible and acerbic member of the literary fantastic community, both online and in person for many years now. You can follow him on Facebook and Twitter. You can leave him comments, and he might even respond. He is also a naturalist with a passion for preserving fragile ecologies, imaginary and real. He is a social media raconteur. He is also head ranger at the VanderMeer Nature Preserve in Tallahassee, Florida. If you haven't checked out Wonderbook, his guide to creating imaginative fiction, you will want to have several copies on hand. That book is full of art depicting all sorts of imaginary ecologies. I think I've even found pictures of the VanderMeer Nature Preserve that were painted sometime in the future. Because of its oracular powers, I keep one copy of Wonderbook to clip art from, another to clip words of advice from, and one just to read around in. VanderMeer includes interviews and craft tips from many of the best writers of fantasy in the world, as well as rad art that can charge up your fantasy battery when it gets low. Seriously, page through and you will be amazed. But we are here to celebrate VanderMeer's fiction. How does one describe it? It is peopled with fungi and flying bears, salamanders and blue foxes, possessed scientists and menacing puppets. Jeweled hummingbirds mate for a tantalizing instant, an instant that recurs across multiple narratives, haunting us with hope. Maybe VanderMeer is the alien among us or inside us, whose imposter syndrome is catching. He has said that he has difficulty breathing at times, but he breathes life into the weirdest assemblage of monsters and lost people since the great Angela Carter. His range is astonishing. It includes time-traveling astronauts who, though dead, manage to get life right in the end. It includes dangerous historical personages such as Aleister Crowley, whose diabolical plan to conquer the world may be defeated, narrowly, with the help of homicidal whimsy. VanderMeer has described a childhood spent raptly watching the nocturnal life of the coral reefs off Fiji. The distant lights of civilization, he writes, seemed deliciously inconsequential, even ridiculous, in comparison with the phosphorescent squid that shot through breaches in the coral, the drab moray eels with gold-veined eyes, the cumbersome cowrie shells with lip-pink snails lumbering gracefully through the sudden spotlight he shone down on them. But as VanderMeer's work shows us, the distant lights of civilization are not deliciously inconsequential. They may be ridiculous, indeed they are increasingly so, but they are also increasingly deadly. VanderMeer illuminates our species' death wish in all its disturbing allure. He also shows us that light in any form fascinates, whether it's a child's flashlight that reveals a hidden undersea world, or the dead glow of a long extinguished lighthouse, or the light of VanderMeer's own brilliant and passionate moral imagination, which shines upon our polluting and despoiling nature and reveals this nature to be one that squeezes the world so tightly that, if allowed to go unchecked, it will leave nothing in the world but itself. He is a builder who can open doors. He is a time traveler who has come back with a vision of a terrible future that can be averted. There is nothing he won't risk to save us from ourselves. Please join me in welcoming Jeff VanderMeer.
Well, thank you for that really wonderful introduction. And I hope you all can hear me clearly. We had a thunderstorm, we have another one, and hopefully that will not affect either the performance or your enjoyment of it. I thought it would be interesting to read two excerpts and a very brief kind of flash fiction that are all first-person narratives that view ecological themes differently and portray them through different voices. And I know some of you have been studying Annihilation, so I thought I would read from Annihilation first and then give you a preview of Hummingbird Salamander, which is another first-person narrative, a novel that's coming out next year. And then end with Earthlings, which is very personally about, kind of about my yard and is accompanied by some images that we'll try to display. And then I'll also be open to your questions and feel free to ask about anything. You can ask about the readings, but I'm happy to answer anything that you want to talk about. The one thing I would say is I'm reading things that I've not read in a long time, and I'm reading things that I've never read before, so bear that in mind. So I'm just going to read the beginning of Annihilation, which, you know, people call me a weird and uncanny writer, but, you know, 95% of the actual prose, the words that are on the page are really observations about our world. And then there's the uncanny part that's about 5 to 10%, depending on the novel. And I also would just say that I can get a little distracted because right outside of our window here, we're kind of elevated in the canopy. This is a time of day when there are barred owls and other things that just kind of flash by the window. So my apologies in advance if I seem distracted, that's why. So Annihilation, the first section of which is called Initiation. And I would just say that the 5 sections of the book are meant to tack in completely different ways so that each section basically makes you realize that it's a different novel than you thought in the section before. But this opening section, I woke up from a dream, wrote down some basic ideas, and then in the morning I woke up again, thankfully, and I wrote the first 10 pages, of which what I'm going to read was part of, and very, very little of this changed in any way past the rough draft. The tower, which was not supposed to be there, plunges into the earth in a place just before the black pine forest begins to give way to swamp, and then the reeds and the wind-gnarled trees of the marsh flats. Beyond the marsh flats and the natural canals lies the ocean, and a little farther down the coast, a derelict lighthouse. All of this part of the country had been abandoned for decades for reasons that are not easy to relate. Our expedition was the first to enter Area X for more than 2 years, and much of our predecessors' equipment had rusted, their tents and sheds little more than husks. All of us, looking out over that untroubled landscape, I do not believe any of us could yet see the threat. There were 4 of us, a biologist, an anthropologist, a surveyor, and a psychologist. I was the biologist. All of us were women this time, chosen as part of the complex set of variables that govern sending the expeditions. The psychologist, who was older than the rest of us, served as the expedition's leader. She had put us all under hypnosis to cross the border to make sure we remained calm. It took 4 days of hard hiking after crossing the border to reach the coast. Our mission was simple: to continue the government's investigation into the mysteries of Area X. The expedition could last days, months, or even years, depending on various stimuli and conditions. We had supplies for 6 months, and another 2 years' worth of supplies had already been stored at the base camp. We had also been assured that it was safe to live off the land if necessary. All of our foodstuffs were smoked or canned or in packets. Our most outlandish equipment consisted of a measuring device that had been issued to each of us, which hung from a strap on our belts, a small rectangle of black metal with a glass-covered hole in the middle. If the hole glowed red, we had 30 minutes to remove ourselves to a safe place. We were not told what the device measured or why we should be afraid should it glow red. After the first few hours, I had grown too used to it and had not looked at it again. We had been forbidden watches and compasses. When we reached the camp, we set about replacing obsolete or damaged equipment with what we had brought and putting up our own tents. We would rebuild the sheds later once we were sure that Area X had not affected us. The members of the last expedition had eventually drifted off one by one. Over time, they had returned to their families. So strictly speaking, they did not vanish. They simply disappeared from Area X and by unknown means reappeared back in the world beyond the border. They could not relate the specifics of that journey. The transference had taken place across a period of 18 months, and it was not something that had been experienced by prior expeditions. But other phenomena could also result in premature dissolution of expeditions, as our superiors put it. So we needed to test our stamina for that place. We also needed to acclimate ourselves to the environment. In the forest near base camp, one might encounter black bears or coyotes. You might hear a sudden croak and watch a night heron startle from a tree branch and distracted step on a poisonous snake, of which there were at least 6 varieties. Long ago, towns had existed here, and we encountered eerie signs of human habitation: rotting cabins with sunken red-tinged roofs, rusted wagon wheel spokes half buried in the dirt, and the barely seen outlines of what used to be enclosures for livestock, now mere ornament for layers of pine needle loam. Far worse, though, was a low, powerful moaning at dusk. The wind off the sea and the odd interior stillness dulled our ability to gauge direction, so that the sound seemed to infiltrate the black water that soaked the cypress trees. This water was so dark we could see our faces in it, and it never stirred, set like glass, reflecting the beards of gray moss that smothered the cypress trees. This water, if you looked out through these areas toward the ocean, all you saw was the black water, the gray of the cypress trunks, and the constant motionless rain of moss flowing down. All you heard was the low moaning. The effect of this cannot be understood without being there. The beauty of it cannot be understood either. And when you see beauty in desolation, it changes something inside you. Desolation tries to colonize you. So obviously the biologist is very much invested in nature, and there are times when I actually feel like Annihilation is darkly funny, because there are whole campfire conversations that the expedition engages in that the biologist has absolutely no interest in relating to her reader, and conversations about the tile tower that they find that I think really reflect how people actually speak semi-logically in emergency situations, but when you really look at the transcript of what they're saying, it's clear that even if they appear calm, they are panicking. Now, I actually talked to a radical environmentalist class in upstate New York at Hobart and William Smith about Annihilation, and I wanted their honest impressions, and a lot of people liked it. Some people obviously didn't like it. And some said, well, look, we like Annihilation, but we want something more direct. We want something really more didactic, you know, that talks about environmental issues. And so I put that in the back of my head, and I thought, well, how do I do that? Because you're not writing an essay as a novelist. You're trying to convey some kind of psychological truth, and you're definitely not trying to lecture the reader. So I just did what I usually do, which is I just put that in the back of my mind and said, subconscious, you know, work on that for a while, and let's see how that comes back out. And so eventually I wrote this novel that's coming out next year called Hummingbird Salamander. And I think just from this description, you can see how I solved it, solved this issue of being more direct. So the summary of the novel basically is that the security consultant, Jane Smith, receives an envelope with a key to a storage unit that holds a taxidermied hummingbird and clues leading her to a taxidermied salamander. Silvina, the dead woman who left the note, is a reputed eco-terrorist and the daughter of an Argentine industrialist. By taking the hummingbird from the storage unit, Jane sets in motion a series of events that quickly spin beyond her control. Soon, Jane and her family are in danger with few allies to help her make sense of the true scope of the peril. Is the only way to safety to follow in Silvina's footsteps? Is it too late to stop? And as she desperately seeks answers about why Silvina contacted her, time is running out for her and possibly for the world. So basically what my subconscious came up with is, well, what about a thriller mystery where the central mystery is about ecological issues so directly that it's no longer didactic, it's just part of the plot. It's part of the interiority of the character as she becomes obsessed with this dead woman and with the mystery that's been set out before her. So I'm going to attempt to, this is the first time I've read from Hummingbird Salamander, so I'm going to attempt to read you a section of it. I think all you need to know is that in this section, she has been researching in a clandestine way because she's afraid if she just Googles stuff that it's going to come back on her, like someone's going to be out there is looking, you know, for people, you know, Googling this eco-terrorist and whatnot. So she's done it kind of like on a burner phone and things like that. And she's found video of Silvina, and she's found details about the hummingbird that she's found in the storage unit that she got the key to from Silvina. And the only other thing I would say is that something fairly unique about this is also at Hobart William Smith. I met an amazing biologist, Dr. Megan Smith Brown. And when it came time to create the hummingbird and the salamander, which are totally fictitious in the story, I thought, oh my God, why don't I ask Megan if she can do this? And then I have to, as a novelist, react to those details and incorporate them and make them emotionally relevant. So I thought that was an interesting constraint, one that would actually make the novel stronger. So the details of the hummingbird that I'm going to read about are all written and created by Dr. Smith Brown. And I think we'll probably talk about that when the book comes out together, because I think it's kind of interesting. The first time I saw Silvina wasn't in the photographs in a file, not really, not in a true sense. In all the photographs, Silvina looked stiff, uncomfortable, resembled a corpse propped up in a chair or leaning against a balcony railing. Back problems plagued her, and she didn't like her photo taken, or she didn't like the photographers, or she told them not to and they did it anyway. First time was a grainy video, 20 seconds in an old nature documentary uploaded to the internet. The lighting was bad on purpose in deference to her sensitivities. I can't remember how many days after I found the hummingbird, I found the video. The shock of wild black hair I noticed first, how she didn't like to tame it or pulled it back in a ponytail rather than deal with it. Then that she didn't know where to put her arms on the chair crossed in her lap. Sylvina had large hands, strong, rough, calloused. She kept looking away, looking down, away from the camera lens, so I almost couldn't see her face. But right at the end, she raised her head, and I saw the tight cheekbones, the firm set of the strong jaw, determined, dangerous. Her eyes were so dark they registered as black, set across a face a little too narrow in a charming way. Slightly sad, distant expression, even when she smiled, but the smile broadened her face too, and then she was kind of beautiful. In her practical clothes, just one level better than army fatigues. If not for the floral pattern of the shirt, she could have been the spokesperson for some people's army. When she crossed her legs, you could see she tucked her khaki pants into hiking boots, a silver bracelet on her right wrist, but no other adornment. Reading glasses on a chain hung down over the shirt, as if she were an old lady in a rocking chair. Later, I would realize the bracelet was from her mother, the one thing she wouldn't give up from her past. Sylvina didn't smile in any photograph, just at the end of the video clip. That was right after the thing they accused her of that followed her around from then on, whether she'd done it or not, before the trial. For a moment, I froze that moment. In that other moment we haven't caught up to yet, replayed the clip. I watched her smile. It kept breaking my heart to know I'd never see her as she really was underneath, that maybe the smile came the closest. Except that was a lie of the heart, of the head. She was who she was all the time. I should have known that already. And then moving further on to her hummingbird research. Hummingbirds are aesthetic and aerobic extremists, read one site. Their tiny bodies hover akin to flying carpets. Did one just zip by? They evolved high in the Andes Mountains with progressive colonization of lower altitudes and expanded latitudes, especially to the north and eventually to the far reaches of Canada and Alaska. They remain restricted to the Americas, with the vast majority of the 300 plus species residents of South America. Information isn't story, Sylvina wrote. No animal should be condensed to a summary in an encyclopedia. But all I had was information at first, and a dead bird's body, because that's all she'd given me. The naiad hummingbird is of moderate size, less than 10 centimeters body length, with an especially long migration that delights the most diligent of birders across its range. Although difficult to find and observe by humans, the brilliant colors and patterns of the males are adaptations to catch the eyes of their mates. I had a large female specimen then, pitch black, no nonsense. They are fine athletes whose stunt repertoire includes backward flight, treading air, and maneuvering precisely in gusty wind, and whose migration between the Pacific Northwest and Argentina equates to several back-to-back ultra-marathons. I tried to imagine traveling that far as an adaptation through so many different kinds of terrain. This was an epic journey and one only allowed due to incredible specializations. The changes a human being would have to undergo to inhabit such places without equipment. Wouldn't they change your point of view too? Wouldn't you become someone else? But it wasn't just the journey, the flowers they used, the nests, all of it, once I had a time to really immerse myself, caught up in a way I hadn't expected, not just because of the mystery, but the data, after all. Who wouldn't be moved by the details? Maybe it was just me, or maybe it was the flush of the first real intel. Status unknown. The last documented observation was in the Stein Valley Heritage Park, British Columbia. Ornithological groups are seeking information, photographic sightings, or recorded calls. Not just rare then, but presumed extinct, last seen in 2007. I felt a pang of emotion as if this was a twist, but a twist that you could have seen coming. And after the pang, it took no time at all. That emotion began to recede from me. Couldn't hold on to it all the time, even though I tried. That month, the southern white rhino and a species of pangolin had gone extinct. Wildfires in 5 countries meant animals were crawling to the sides of roads to beg people speeding by in cars for water. People were poisoning vultures and shooting bats out of the sky, scared of pandemics. To care more meant putting a bullet into your brain, so like many, I had learned to care less. Slovena called it the fatal adaptation. Alone with my thoughts, this was all unsettling, destabilizing. Excitement, joy, sadness, unease in the briefest period. Even now, I can't truly explain the nexus of that and how it rippled through me. So I focused on the why. Why would a person named Slovena leave me this particular taxidermied animal? I saw the route the hummingbird took as evidence. Northwest, so local to me during part of the year. They might even have flown right through our neighborhood in the middle of the night, headed somewhere that cared enough to put out sugar water or plant wildflowers. What kind of person would send this message? Sometimes a founder's psyche in my day job became reflected in their company and thus in how they handled security. But this wasn't about what happened subconsciously. This was a person who couldn't afford to be direct, who didn't trust me, but for some reason had to tell me something, bound by the rules of a game I couldn't see clear yet. Usually a message wasn't passive. Usually on some level, a message so dramatic called out for action. But Slovena hadn't asked for anything, except I thought to follow the clues. There in the parking lot, I loved that hummingbird with a fierce and protective love. But resentment flared up too. I could neither get rid of nor keep the hummingbird. Slovena had made some essential decision for me, and it came with baggage. What she had given me was illegal, contraband. If caught with it, I could be prosecuted. I should have destroyed the hummingbird, could have tried to find a way to save myself, remained frozen instead. Not because of the mystery of the word salamander in her message, but because of the blank spaces between the word hummingbird and salamander. The more I stared at the piece of paper, the more those lines of blankness ate at me. Something watched at me from those coordinates, and if something watched me, I was already involved. Code or symbol, distress signal, or warning. So that is an excerpt from Hummingbird Salamander. Again, I've never read that before, so thank you for your kindness in listening to it. I think I'll close the reading portion with this flash fiction that is in the incomplete encyclopedia of the Anthropocene Connectedness by a publisher out of Copenhagen. And they were kind enough to assign me the word Earthlings. And as soon as I saw that word, I thought about our yard and the many Earthlings that inhabit it, including the raccoons. And I thought that's really what I wanted to explore. And I wanted to explore kind of like what it is to, on a day-to-day basis, see an individual animal that you come to know in some way and yet can never know in some way. And so I want to read this slightly experimental flash fiction, which is accompanied by some images once I read this preamble to it. When you came to this place among the leaves and soft shadows, this place among the branches through which blue skies shone, that smelled rich and green in the wind that made the trees so strange and rough, the wind that slowed to bleed into and through you, they told you would find a home here, that you would forget your origin and your name, find a home here. 1. At 7:21 on 2nd of November, a rainless day, the Earthling stared at you in a way unfamiliar, and you could not, must not, will never hold its gaze. There was in the stance and the eye a knowledge of you that was unbearable. 2. The encounter at 4:34 p.m. on November 2nd, or was it November 3rd, was unexpected and not what it first seemed, the surveillance that burnt upon your face that rested there with a sharpness born of long regret, welled up from the forest floor, from an earthling who stood immobile but alert and made you feel like a traitor, no, an intruder, no, a traitor, a threat like a thief or hurricane or a sound too loud. You could not understand for the longest time why you stood there, staring down at her, staring up and wept, why you should have to weep for being held to account. But when you were distracted for a moment, startled by a sound, she disappeared as if she had never been there. So utter, so total, so loved by camouflage or speed or both, it felt as if you had disappeared with her. 3. November, later in November, November, it was November, maybe it was November. A new earthling to solve as your bones soaked in the cold. You did not mean to make it run or chase it behind a tree, but those things happened anyway. The stress of regard was not the moment or the point. The stress of regard was the aftershock. Or you felt you had seen this earthling before and that it had seen you before, and this now was mere retort or renewal or further rehearsal of a point or mode or relationship that had already begun, been forged, dissolved, resolved. But the eyes of the earthling held you and you shuddered, for you could not quell their fear of you, not this one or all the ones before. And this made you fearful and want to be small and quiet, something dissolving, some sense of the sky melting into the ground. 4. Came screaming forth from the canopy, came screaming forth in a month that was a month that was a month or moment after or before or during the other months and moments, came screaming forth as a sound that had startled you before, revealed as something earthly with fierce demons, no demeanor that admitted to no fault or weakness. It destroyed the branch the talons clung to, even as immobile, inviolate, as if forever perched and forever destroying. Only slowly as you recovered from the sound, as you stood so very still, did you admit to the beauty of the earthling, in the way its feathers became a disguise, both sharp and diffuse, both ghost and the thing the ghost had once been, and in this way showed its prey the truth of past, present, and future. For this being traveled through time continually, calculated the next velocity pierced to a point on a map. But of your velocity, you had no idea, nor where you had been pierced. Distance was distress, not purchase, and the glare of gaze impervious fixed upon you and showed you the past, present, and future, yet spared your life. 5. From a vantage above, on some day in some year of a decade disguised by mist, you came unawares upon an earthling that had no knowledge or awareness of you, an earthling that might not know of you at all or your deeds or reputation. You watched with such a strange, sad delight that it was like a song. It felt wrong to observe such openness, such unguardedness. It felt wrong and yet compulsion. You could not halt the observation, could not let the earthling remain unmapped. You tunneled into reason that many earthlings observed by you had enjoyed ecstatic many moments already where they had relaxed into the comfort of being invisible. Yet the longer you stood there as scrutiny and the longer the earthling lingered, the more agitated you became. Lifted one foot, then the other, tried to turn away, could not, dropped to your knees, felt a shooting pain, found your mouth become open and issuing forth a scream that racked you raw, sound muffled by the sky, pouring into you through the branches, pouring into your lungs, your bones, and destroying you entirely, until consciousness was kept from you, muffled and indistinct and far away. And when you came to, you looked around nervously like a new thing, and you understood now your weeping of the first day, even if you would never write it down or tell anyone, but only keep it tethered to the center of you in the unobserved place. 6. The year is the moon through the trees, eclipsing your thoughts with a smile. The year is something cold that smells of food and must be chased. The year is long yet compressed into a single moment. You have long since become a being of the night, the soothe of night, the lull and hum, the bottomless dark lake that steals your vision. You could not take all that light for so long. It revealed all of you until there was nothing left but light. So in the dark, you made a new home. In the dark, perhaps the other earthlings would not see you so hard or so difficult or so long or so fast or so aching. Perhaps you had believed the terror that followed you would be contained within and you could forget. But in time, trundling along time, there came the disallowance, disavowal, an earthling across the bridge that spanned the creek. There came all disguised and in the grace of soft padding beauty, a earthling that glimpsed you, all of you, even as she was wary of what might be received in return. The earthling looked at you and wondered what you were and what you were to her, to yourself. And you held her gaze because you were desperate and you felt small and you were alone. Then the earthling turned and made to leave you, but you could not let it leave. And so you followed the earthling into the dark because she was a form of love, because she let you. And soon across the bridge there came a blessed nothing composed of an infinity of moments of which you know nothing and everything. And after, in the swell of roots impactful toward the sky, after through the tree branches soaking up the wind, when you knew what they meant, bereft of reason, but steeped in something deeper, after, there is no wait now. And so that's Earthling, which was a little more intense at the end than I remembered it, for me at least. So thank you for listening. And I think, Annie, you were going to moderate questions or issues or anything that might come up.
Oh my God, that was so wonderful and moving.
Thank
you for the reading. And I would like to open up questions from the audience. What we're going to do is you can put questions in the chat and I will relay them to Jeff VanderMeer. So if anyone does have questions, or please do let us hear them. I got a little verklempt myself there. That was gorgeous, and so is he frozen? Jeff, are you frozen?
Yeah, it looks like he is.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a way to call him. Maybe he could reconnect.
I don't have a way to call him, but I will email him right now. My guess is that he is doing that right now, and that he will be back in just a moment. So those of you who do have questions, why don't you gather your thoughts and give them a sort of cleanup, because I know that I often grope when I'm overwhelmed with emotion. I grope for the right words to express that emotion. That Earthlings was gorgeous. Okay, so I'm seeing talk about the ways that rhetoric and rhyme inform the images and how image informs the writing. John, I will do so. One thing I want to tell you though, while we're waiting, is that that VanderMeer in Wonderbook, which is reversed because I'm holding it up to the camera, has a lot of beautiful, crazy images in the book. So he is someone who works with images a lot, and he has worked with illustrators on some of his books, which is a terrific thing to look at, to take in, because it's all about connectedness, right? I mean, it's all about exactly what he was talking about in the Earthlings flash fiction piece, which emphasizes the way that we are all connected, but also every work of art, every literary work, the world around us, all of these things feed into each other. I'm going to take a quick look to see if he's rebooting. He said he'll be right back. So we are just here to wait. Jeff Chapman, you are very kind. Thank you. I am a longtime fan of Jeff VanderMeer, who is back with us.
I'm so sorry about that. I don't know why, but my computer decided to wrench away my ability to plan updates by updating everything on my computer just then. So anyway, I'm back. I'm ready to answer questions. My apologies.
No, that's actually, par for the course, right? 2020.
Oh my God.
But so we had one question that I have to find. One of our professors of art history, John Corso Esquivel, asked if you would talk about the ways that rhetoric and rhyme inform the images, and how image informs the writing.
Right. Well, there's two huge impulses from my formative years. One is the image, because my mother is a painter, and so we always had an art studio in addition to my dad being a scientist and having a lab around. And then also I started out writing as a poet. So I had published about 60 poems before I started delving into fiction. So that rhythm has always been extremely important, and it's been extremely important, if I'm understanding the question correctly, to the interiority of character. I hope it's obvious from the three things I read that even in a first person, or I guess the third one was actually kind of like second person, but there's the word choice matters. The rhythm of how somebody speaks or thinks or writes matters, and that sometimes has a poetic cadence. So often when I'm starting a novel, I'm basically trying to get the cadence and the rhythm correct of the character voice. And so I'll revise the first 10 pages of a novel multiple, maybe 15 times, until I have that kind of like progression of almost a kind of a music correct in my head, and then I can follow the character. So, with the biologist, it was how she views nature and how that kind of unfurls in this kind of unhurried and yet oddly ominous way for the reader. And then with Hummingbird Salamander, I'm not sure how obvious it was in that excerpt, but I actually use a lot of sentence fragments and break up the text. So the rhythm is always is there, but it's a broken rhythm on purpose to reflect something about her character, and then also what's going on in the narrative. So I'm always thinking about that. And sometimes it's more prevalent, like in Dead Astronauts, which has actual prose poetry in it. And I don't think that you can separate the delivery of the image from the actual very specific words and cadence that's being used.
I was thinking of Dead Astronauts as you were speaking of that, because the music of that is so vital to.
It's one of the few of my novels that's actually, I think parts of it are better read aloud than read on the page, so to speak. So.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Professor Jeff Insko, who is teaching an environmental humanities class and has a question for you.
Okay.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for a great reading. That was all really terrific. And I have like 100 questions, and there are questions my students wanted me to ask you about annihilation, but I'm not going to ask any of those right now. But maybe if I have a chance later. I'm really struck by your interpolation of the biologist's descriptions of the hummingbird into your novel. And if you'll permit me a Melville reference, since it reminds me very much of the way that Melville in Moby Dick just sort of imports all kinds of scientific information from various sources about whales and so forth. And partly he's doing that, as I'm sure it's because he's interested in art and science as very different ways of knowing. And he's picking fights with the whale experts and so on. And there's even the line, I think, in the part that you read, that information is not a story, I think was the phrase, if I had it right, which I think is really beautiful. And so I would just be interested in you talking a little bit more about the kind of conversation you imagine yourself to be having as an artist and a novelist with scientists and biologists about the non-human world.
Well, I always keep in mind that a lot of early fiction was actually embodied in those philosophical journeys where early scientists were trying to, like astronomers and stuff, were trying to they were trying to present their thesis and they were trying to extrapolate. And so they would write it in the form of like a dream journey. So it was actually a piece of fiction, but it was trying to get across something about their field, so that there was a muddiedness between fiction and nonfiction to begin with regard to what we think of as at least Western science. And then I just think that I have also, like you mentioned, Melville and arguing with whale experts or whatever it is he's doing there. I love nonfiction that often reads like fiction because I really don't think we're all that objective. So one of my favorite books of all time is a book just called Penguins from the 60s, which is ostensibly just a general guide to penguins. But by chapter 2, it's pretty clear that the writer is just sticking the knife in to his rivals and using the book to do it. So it veers away from fact into basically being about this deeply bitter man. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a fiction book. So I think about things like that. And then with regard to Hummingbird Salamander, I thought, first of all, it's much different if I receive information I can't change. Then my brain has to accrete story around it in a way that I wouldn't if those were malleable elements. If there were things I came up with myself that would be too easy in a way, and since they're so central to the story, it felt like they needed to have some resistance to them, so there would be some friction there, so to speak. And then it was just a matter of how to convey it. So because we're not in Melville's time, and it's a thriller ostensibly in the form, there's not going to be a patience for long chapters, right? But I did do something similar with where I placed the information about the salamander, because you don't get the salamander information until much later. But I found a place to put it, I think, where the emotional resonance for the character in simply repeating the details of this salamander's life cycle and how that actually reflects something about her is hopefully extremely poignant to some degree. So that's the thing that I think about too. Where is this non-fictional information, this exposition, going to have the most emotional resonance? So it's more than the information, even if the information itself is interesting too.
That's good. Thank you.
I want to just pick up because you were talking about emotional resonances, and one thing that I was struck by the Hummingbird Salamander excerpt was that you were talking quite a bit about the distance from the woman as you described her. And this echoed for me the distance that the migrators had to fly and the specialization that they had to undergo to adapt to these incredibly long journeys. And I wondered if you were, if this kind of emotional distancing and our emotional relationships is something you're exploring as well in a kind of undercurrent way.
Yeah, definitely, because you definitely find out that Sylvina, in terms of where she lived and everything and what her life was like, identified very much with aspects of how the hummingbird actually migrates. And so there's a doubling there. There's also the issue of how you draw a reader into a story, which is a very basic thing, but a very important thing for something like this. So, like in Annihilation, I used a very risky proposition, which is that you're simply going to be interested in the facts of the expedition, and the emotional resonance and the whole thing of her relationship with her husband and everything else is going to come later and kick in later. But in the meantime, that one thing will hold you and be enough for you want to read further. In Hummingbird Salamander, there's really more of a dual approach because the two things are intertwined. So she becomes somewhat obsessed with the animal in general, but then she also becomes obsessed with the mystery of who this person was. And that's enough to propel her to the point where there's no real turning back from what she's uncovered, if that makes any sense. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yes, you did. It was wonderful. So I'm going to go to an audience question. This goes to Annihilation from Bob. What is the world like after Area X has spread and humans are not gone, but transformed and or no longer dominant?
Well, I mean, I think you get a little hint of that, oddly, at the end of Authority in a sinister way with regard to Whitby and certain aspects of the Southern Reach building. And I think that you get some little hint of it at the end of Acceptance in a more benign way. But, you know, I feel like the reason I didn't write beyond Acceptance to show you that world fully is that it's really unknowable to the human mind, and the character arcs kind of end before that, no matter what that means. So a few years later, I wrote this story called This World is Full of Monsters, that I thought of as actually showing that without actually being set in the Annihilation universe. And that story is online if you all haven't seen it. But I really thought, you know, what if an alien invasion was like contamination on a very visceral level, and so this guy is contaminated and then wakes up 100 years later. And then I used the life cycle of flatworms and various other organisms as the actual structure and plot of the story, and then also, so that story I think of as actually kind of portraying that and trying to get at portraying something that's unknowable. That helps.
Well, I think all your work really is tackling that and successfully, you know, lighting that part of our brain that it desires to follow the mysteries. I think that's extraordinary. So I have I'm trying to see here. A student asks, as someone who writes surrealist and imaginative fiction, how do you incorporate theme into your imagery?
You know, I think, I don't know where it comes from or whatever, but every writer has like a bedrock of things that they just in their gut know they don't have to worry about. And so theme is really not something that I have to worry about. I think because I trust my subconscious a lot, and it just is always there. It may be that certain elements of the story, once I finish the rough draft, support that theme better than others. So I think, you know, this scene doesn't really resonate, and also there's other reasons why it shouldn't be in there, because it's not just about theme. But, you know, I think that's just kind of hardwired into my perspective. And so it's sometimes hard to talk about, but what's interesting is to see how the approach to theme can change because of things like there being a zillion academic papers about the Southern Reach trilogy. And I read all of that. And so I often find that my brain's changed by it because I encounter interpretations that I didn't intend but are interesting or valid, or texts are referred to as being influential on me that I haven't read, and then I read them. And so the themes, you know, come back, and they come back in a different way. And it's not self-conscious at that point because I've kind of subsumed it, and it's come back out through the subconscious again. But it definitely means that also helps my work change with regard to the fact that I'm almost always dealing with environmental themes, but that I don't want to write the same book in the same perspective over and over again.
Oh my God, you do not write the same book over and over again.
And I have to be honest, I feel extremely lucky that despite not writing the same book over and over again, that people are still reading me. I still actually have a publishing contract, because that's usually not a good recipe for having a long career.
Well, I don't know how many people have the imaginative resources that you have, but Now, I might be totally off base here, but I thought that there was another Area X book on Simmer.
Yeah, I always thought there might be another book that was set basically in the week before the border came down, but that also delved more into the history before the Area X came down, but that was also relevant to it, because I always thought the Science and Seance Brigade, or the Science, yes, that they had a lot more to their story. So I just let that simmer, and so am working slowly on a novel called Absolution that I think doesn't in any way cynically extend it, is something that seems natural and again fits within this larger group of books that are about the environment and does something different. And so that's also very personal to me, because a lot of it is about people I've met on the Forgotten Coast here in North Florida, and that comes out even more probably. And then also because I've met actual biologists and environmentalists much more since Annihilation from this area. So all of that kind of comes out again in interesting ways.
Yeah, that's terrific, because you are helping scientists to see the world through your fiction, but you're also helping us to see the world through scientists' eyes, which is, I think, so really necessary. That kind of, and that goes back to what you were talking about in the Earthlings piece and connectedness. Really lovely. I have a question here. Mr. VanderMeer, you mentioned that you trust your subconscious and this informs your work. Was that learned, or do you think that it is something you always had, trusting your subconscious?
Well, I think I was really taken by something that Nabokov said, which is that he always wrote down every idea that ever came to him. He had these little note cards, which was a brilliant idea, because he'd have a little fragment on each, and then he could put them in novel order, so that by the time he'd stop thinking about something, he actually kind of had a rough draft or little fragments of it. And I took that as something that was important. And then Angela Carter, who you mentioned, also believed very much, as one of the surrealists or post-surrealists, in accessing that part of your brain. And for me, it's just a very practical thing. It's like I have never not written down a little idea that's come to me, no matter what the context. I'll be at a dinner party and I will completely break off from that to do whatever. And what that means is that my subconscious, first of all, knows I'm going to reward it. And so the ideas keep coming. Ideas are not a problem for me. Sorting through those and figuring out what to do, that's where it comes into. But then also, literally, for Annihilation, I can put an idea in there. So I was like, I want my brain, I mean, it may just be a mental construct, but it was like, I want to write about Florida, but I don't know how yet. I just want you to be, the wheels be churning in the backdrop, or some other thing. Like, I want to write it more directly about the environment. And then I just let it naturally kind of pop out. I often, right before I go to sleep, I will, if I'm struggling with some aspect of a novel, I will spend a day not thinking about it. Then right before I go to sleep, I will think directly about the problem and just kind of engage with it. And then 9 times out of 10, when I wake up in the morning, I have the answer to that. So at the same time, I'm also a big fan of mechanical things with regard to writing. Like, if there's a weakness I'm perceiving, or if I think that there's something on the prose level that I've let myself slip into, then I will mechanically work on removing that. So it's a very big combination of organic and mechanical approaches to creative writing.
Oh, that's terrific. This takes us a little bit to a bit of a different tack, but Mark asks, if you've seen yourself going into Area X, what would be your unique sightings and experiences in 2020?
Well, it might seem like a pleasant vacation compared to, first of all, there probably wouldn't be a lot of people to contaminate me, and hopefully it would be one of the expeditions where nothing happens. I mean, that's the thing about that I find kind of funny too, is that there's probably a couple expeditions there where nothing really happened, but you're not going to hear about those because it's not very exciting. I don't know. It's I hike the place that inspired Area X all the time, so and I still sometimes get this shiver because when you're hiking alone, I think over time you develop this facility where when there are eyes upon you, you realize it somehow, even though you don't know what's observing you. It can be something very benign, but you still have that feeling. And so that still kind of conjures up the mystery of Area X for me.
I'm just so struck by the resonance of those images that I quoted from one of your essays about your upbringing in Fiji, and how they are just continuing to reverberate through all of your work. But they grow more complex, more sophisticated, more, they have multi-layered.
Well, I do think that the hummingbird and hummingbird sound matter definitely comes from, as a child, seeing these hummingbirds in Cusco in a kind of mystical state, just because I was so out of it because of asthma and allergies and stuff. And so, you know, it's definitely true that there are moments in nature that have been just absolutely amazing and unusual in my childhood that are very influential, for sure.
Right, and of course the child's experience is so connected to our experience of the subconscious or unconscious. So it seems like you have a direct channel to both childhood and to your unconscious processes. I wanted to actually ask you, this is a little bit, I'm just kind of having fun here now, but
Sure.
so Cormac McCarthy says that he thinks that the unconscious doesn't trust language, that language came about something that a faculty we developed much later than we as humans, you know, were sort of walking around, building fire and doing things. And I just wondered if you had a comment on that.
Not really, but I do feel like there is a logic to sound that sometimes should not be secondary to sense. And I think maybe that's something early on that I got dinged for because I would go with it too much. But I definitely feel like I'll be going along and I will make what seems like a mistake, but it feels right with regard to the language, or something that seems irrational, and I'll leave it in because there's something about it that I feel very superstitious about changing. But I don't really have anything else to say about that. I find McCorm, his work hit or miss for me. There's some stuff I love a lot, and there's other things that I don't. But I feel like he's that kind of writer that I do think he takes a lot of chances. And I think that's one thing that I admire in like an Angela Carter too, is that, you know, not being afraid, being perfectly happy to kind of fall on your face or be ridiculous, even when you don't mean to be, recognizing that not every reader, you know, like Dead Astronauts, I'm sure parts of it are in such a kind of hyper poetic key that it does seem that for some readers it just doesn't work, and that's fine. You just have to know what's actually just right for the text.
Great, thank you. So Rashonda asks, why did you use all women to complete the mission to Area X?
Well, I think you know, at first they just were their function. They were just the job title. When I woke up that morning and wrote the draft, the first few pages, and I didn't really think about whether they were men or women, how they identified, and then I slept on it. And the next morning, you know, I had thought about what I thought about consciously that first day is, you know, I really hate novels and movies where it's like there's one woman and it's kind of a token situation, and that also by not engaging with and thinking about stereotypes and cliches like that, you actually wind up contaminating your text in unuseful ways. So I woke up the next morning and I actually had the characters in my head and they were all women. So that's when I knew I wasn't going to change it or try to make them, you know, and so it was kind of a combination of, again, conscious thought, and then I just actually had them as characters, and that's who they were going to be. And I was happy about that because I felt then there were certain things I could do as a novelist that would be useful, like not give them physical descriptions, because I think that's, you know, to actually kind of make a comment on a tertiary level, make a comment about how male novelists are usually pretty shitty at doing that. And then also how I think women are more judged by their appearance, for example, in narrative or in real life sometimes, and what that means for how you view what they do, what they say, and things like that. So, and then also not giving them physical descriptions allowed the descriptions of nature to literally be more prevalent on the page and encroach on the characters. And I thought that was a useful claustrophobia. So there are all kinds of elements then that came into play once I had decided they were all women. And then of course I didn't actually reveal until the second book what their ethnicity was, which I thought was also a useful thing, because Authority, the second book, is supposed to completely disorient you. And so I thought it would be really useful if people have built up a mental image and then they reach the second book and that's shattered for some of them. And that would be part of the claustrophobia and the way the book is supposed to change you.
I see, yeah. Very interesting. I remember that Ursula K. Le Guin mentioned that her Earthsea novels all had people of color, and that no one seemed to notice this till 40 years later, even though she and they would repeatedly illustrate them as white people and not as people of color. So it's an interesting thing that she had to work with too. I have another question here from Christina. What do you consider the relationship between art and science? For example, does art inspire science or the opposite, or can they exist without each other?
All of the above, maybe. I don't know. It's I get a lot of constant inspiration from the way that scientists describe things to me. So, for example, Dr. Smith Brown, she also, because this was the Finger Lakes area, she actually also is the one who brings the research vessel for Hobart and William Smith colleges out on the lake with the grad students. And they study all kinds of like semi-microscopic shrimp and all kinds of things like that. And if I just read about these shrimp in a textbook, it would have been nothing that would have necessarily inspired me. But the whole experience of going out on this vessel, seeing them studying it, what they were trying to study, what they were looking at, what the context was around the creatures that they were studying when they put them under the microscope, all of this suggested story to some degree. And so I really love getting to kind of like go on expeditions like that and actually talk to scientists, because every individual scientist too is going to talk about what they love or what they're studying in a different way, and have had a different upbringing to get to that point. So I always see it as a very unique experience and something that's very valuable.
Oh my God, I just want to tell you that I saw a lot of parallels between Power's Overstory and his use of scientists and science with your own work, even though yours is
interesting.
Yeah, it was. But I would like to go to Professor Jeff Insko now, who has a question for you.
What a great conversation. And Jeff, I wanted to circle back to that experience that you had talking about annihilation to the radical environmentalist class. And you occupy this really interesting place in what are some pretty vibrant conversations right now about the relationship between the humanities and the arts and planetary crisis and global warming, climate change, and Cli-Fi and Weird Thoreau and all that stuff. And you've talked a fair amount about this. But I'm kind of interested in both in terms of your own thinking about your own work specifically, but then also maybe even more broadly about the role you see narrative, storytelling, art playing in contending with this moment of emergency that we find ourselves in. And I think it's a question that's sort of related for me as I talk to my students about it as a professor of literature who's interested in those questions. I think it's related to the question that someone else is kind of re-asking about envisioning how you envision the ideal future relationship between humans and nature. I mean, I really think for me that one of the things art can do is help us to imagine different forms of relations between the human and non-human worlds. And I think you're really great at that. And I'm wondering the extent to which you're conscious of conveying that to an audience, in part as a way of contending with this moment of crisis?
Right. Well, first of all, I actually have, I actually get asked to climate conferences quite a bit, climate crisis conferences, and then also to talk to scientists about narrative technique. A lot of scientists, and I feel this is so unfair, are concerned about how they can convey their data, how they can convey their findings, especially in the climate crisis sphere. And I feel like this is so unfair because our politicians are letting us down by not taking that information, converting it into something for the general audience and their constituents to then bring into the policy sphere. That's really their job, and the policy wonks who are their aides. But how helpful is it for me to talk about these things with them? I don't know, except that more and more I'm also talking in a non-fictional space. I'll be talking about rewilding and whatnot. So I'm not just talking about fiction. And so then I have to learn different narrative techniques myself. So there's that. Then as the novelist, I have to decide what territory it is I'm kind of staking out. And for me, it's not about the what if, it's not the speculative element. I'm not really concerned about the accuracy of that. Obviously, because I have a novel Born with a giant flying murderous bear in it, but the psychological truth. So take Born, for example. I think there's something direct in a surrealist sphere about one day, the physicality of this creature destroying part of the city you live in and making visible to some degree something that's also true about what climate crisis does, extreme weather, everything else. So there's, first of all, how do you make something both real and a metaphor, which is something I continually work on because it has to be real first. And then what can I convey of a psychological truth? So Annihilation was kind of like a slow contamination. The environmental themes are kind of, once you're in its grip, are more even in authority and acceptance, so that hopefully you feel it kind of in your body and you kind of reach the conclusions yourself. And then with something like Born, it's just literally following someone around a ruined city as they try to eke out an existence. No matter how surreal the elements around, there are actually people who are having to do that right now. So if you can convey something about that feels real, that seems really important. And then of course with Hummingbird Salamander, there's also this issue, talking about the class, where you go to some radical environmental classes, and really what they're only able to talk about is performative stuff, like putting a banner up at a Republican convention or things like that, because a lot of like very legitimate ways of protest have been illegalized, made illegal. So novels are laboratories too. Novels are things where stuff happens that can't happen or shouldn't happen in real life, but you can still explore it. So there's that as well. But the one thing I always rebel at is the idea of prediction, or the idea of the what if moment. I think those things are a dime a dozen, and it's really getting at the psychological truths, so that the truths of our moment live in your body through reading a piece of fiction, and maybe that will convince someone. And I don't mean a climate change denier, but I do think that a novelist can change the mind or affect somebody who thinks that climate change is something that's still 30 or 40 years off and they don't have to do anything. So.
Thank you.
I do have a follow-up question. You were talking about fiction versus nonfiction, and these different, I think you were talking about rhetorical strategies or narrative approaches. And I know that your Born universe is now going to be moved to television as your Annihilation novel was adapted as well. And I know we have a number of screenwriters in our audience who might be interested to see if that changed or affected your creative process. And I just want to tag this by saying, I cannot believe that you read academic treatments of your own work. That's amazing.
Oh, I find it really fascinating. It's really, really useful to me, and I'm really grateful it exists. It's supremely flattering, even when they hate something, you know what I mean? Or they're saying this isn't as good as something else. That's fine. It's very interesting to me. But no, I mean, the thing is that because of the way I work with images, there's always going to be a percentage of my fiction that is more cinematic or seemingly more cinematic than others. And there's a lot that I actually steal from film in terms of translation, not the crudeness of like a jump cut or something, but you know, the way that somebody does cinematography or something like that. But I think that it hasn't really affected me because I haven't done any screenplays. I have done 3 things, unfortunately went nowhere, where I did kind of a treatment of one of my short stories where I didn't feel comfortable doing an actual pilot teleplay, but I was fine with doing a bullet point thing of the beats and progressions, what the scenes would be. And I felt like if that had gotten off the ground and someone had done a teleplay based on it, the treatment, then I would have been able to see how it was done and organically get there. That's really how I work. So I can't just read a book on how to do a screenplay and then do a screenplay. I have to have some element of mimicry involved. I learned to write novels by transcribing parts of novels, sometimes by literally having them in front of me and typing them to just get the feel of typing them, sometimes by trying to recreate a chapter, not seeing it, and see what the difference is between the version I remembered and what was on their page. But I very much have to inhabit it that way. So that question is still outstanding as to whether I could ever actually write a screenplay or a teleplay.
I think it's so useful for students to hear that you would take a chapter of a novel and try to write it yourself and see how it evolves, or that you would transcribe the beats of a scene. Did you want to speak any more about the pacing of scenes or the relationship between pacing and imagery?
Pacing, they say that you can't teach somebody to have a good sense of pacing for scenes and stuff, but that means so many different things depending on what kind of fiction you're writing. So for Hummingbird Salamander, which is mimicking a thriller structure, where I will begin a scene and end it, you know, some of what happens within, whether I'm ending on an action or reaction, is very different than, say, Dead Astronauts, or very different than Southern Reach. And as I say in Wonderbook, I'm a firm believer that sometimes the difference between where you end and begin and end a scene is a difference between whether a reader interprets it as being a certain kind of fiction or not. And so I look at this very, very carefully. And I think, you know, and sometimes I will abnormally prolong a scene because there's some awkward reason why that should be. But I'm constantly interrogating the things. And what I'm saying is that if I have a sense of pacing, there may be certain things that came naturally to me, but there were also things I learned just simply by interrogating all the scenes. And also what I do is sometimes, like if I feel like something's wrong, like in Authority, I was like, something is wrong in the, like I had lost my way in it, because usually I can hear the music and I can hear the kind of progressions in my head, and it's like that whatever it is. And I'd lost that. So I just went ahead and I reversed outlined what I had, which was basically write down every scene, everything that's happening in the scene based on what's on the page. And sometimes when I do that, I'll realize, oh, this needed to be moved up. This replicates, this doesn't need to be there. Or this does need to replicate it, but it's in the wrong place for that to have any resonance. And also, oh, this thing I thought was actually on the page in a scene isn't at all. And so I think especially earlier on, when I used to probably start writing a lot sooner than I do now, this was very useful. The one thing over time I would say is that I tend to write the thing a lot later. Like I let it evolve in my head a lot longer, and in little fragments I scribble down, because I've learned that I can write something too soon, but I can never write something too late. For me, every writer is going to be different. Some people definitely will spoil an idea if they sit on it too long. You know, because of that, by the time I tend to write, I already tend to have it pretty fully formed, and the structure doesn't change as much as it used to.
Right. That's partly, I think, because you've been working so long and you've really come to trust your own rhythms, is my guess.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
I wanted to, for the students in our audience, I wanted to have you talk a little bit about your history as a writer. I was an early follower. I actually,
wow.
when you had the Vanderworld website, I don't know if you remember that.
I do remember that.
A long time ago.
Yes. Wow.
And I remember you talking about you still had a day job then, and you were wrestling with the fact that, you know, you had to make a living but that it was taking too much from your creative life. And then you decided, I think what you said is to invest in yourself. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about that, like when you know you can do that.
Well, it's very much a psychological thing. Like, I got a advance that would have been enough to live off of for a book, maybe 6 years before I actually became a full-time writer. But I wasn't psychologically ready for what it really looks like is you've won a small lottery, very small lottery, and then you feel like you have to live off of it the rest of your life, even though that might not be true. So I wasn't ready for the psychological fact of not getting a paycheck every couple of weeks. So that was a pressure point where I could have done it. I learned a lot having a full-time job. And of course, you know, I had a full-time job, sometimes 60 hours a week for 25 years of my career as a writer. So, you know, and I just expected I would always have it. And I was just very lucky that this strange little book, Annihilation, hit really big because, you know, even though you're getting advances that you might be able to live on, you don't know what the consistency will be. And also it's just inconsistent in general. But then in 2007, conditions in the day job deteriorated to the point where I couldn't do it anymore. And it was really affecting the writing. So Anne was kind enough to say, you know, as long as you're holding up your end, you know, your expenses, and there's a firewall there, then pursue the full-time writing. So there was a point in 2007 through 2009 where, you know, literally I could have gone back to a day job, you know, that's not the worst thing in the world. Some people need to have that and then also write. For me, it turned out that it was actually much better not to, and that I was much clearer in my writing, but that's not the case for everyone. And it was a near thing. I mean, there was at one point where I had a book sale that I didn't say was because if I don't have this book sale, I'm going back to a full-time job. But if Neil Gaiman hadn't retweeted or whatever our book sale, and we hadn't done well with it, I don't know if I would have had the headspace to naturally kind of write Annihilation, which just kind of came up out of nowhere. But it's different. It's different for everyone, and I'm just extremely fortunate right now.
That's I think really good for people who are beginning their writing careers to hear, is just how long it takes, just that you need to sometimes most times have a full-time job and then continue to trust yourself, continue to explore your unconscious.
And I think also that it depends on what kind of job it is for you. Like for me, having technical writing and editing jobs, depending on what they were actually really useful, because it meant, because I'm not a writer of fiction who writes every day, but writes in spurts, it meant that I was always writing something. And that kind of, even if it was a different kind of writing, it gave me practice and it was different enough. It didn't impinge on my imagination in the way that something else might have. And then there are people I know, like Matt Bell, who loves to teach and also write as well. And he loves both of those things. And I know from having done some teaching that I can't write and teach in the same way that I can write and have a technical editing job. So it's really about finding out what your own rhythms and processes are and what your mental headspace requires, and less about, you know, and when I do creative writing residencies and stuff, I am always trying to find out what the student wants to do with their writing, what they want to do with their career, and then try to give them, from my experience, what strategies work for them specifically, not impose any general thing, but just literally form fitted to each person, because I know how different it needs to be for every different writer.
I am just gonna have to put a little tag here. Matt Bell was my student.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, he went to Oakland.
He's
Yeah,
a great guy, a great writer. Yeah.
oh my God, we've had him here to read.
That's so funny. I really didn't know that. I really didn't.
It's really funny. Yeah, he's terrific. I mean, he came into my class knowing how to write already, so it wasn't like, you know, I taught him how to write. I'm not claiming that, but he was just great to work
That's
with.
awesome. That's great.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about publishing today for students who are trying to get into it, if you have any advice for them.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is be true to who you are as a writer, which should be self-evident, but I do see a lot of writers who come to me and we have like a consult in addition to the creative writing, you know, experience, the workshop, who are paying a little too much attention to trends or to what fellow students are saying or doing. And the fact of the matter is that there's only the thing that's going to be personal to you or of most interest to you, whatever it is that motivates you to write. And that's the thing that you should work on and not worry about anything else, especially, I would say, in the context of publishing being very volatile and unpredictable. And at the same time, there being so many different pathways to things. So, you know, there are certainly students who I've said, you know, you need to get some publication credits, but once you do, don't be too shy to have your first book be something that you do as an ebook yourself. And then other people will say, you absolutely have to get an agent right now and do this and go the traditional publishing route. So I guess what I would say is that there are so many different ways to get published that it's actually more about what you need. And that even has to do with things like book deals. Like there was a book deal I took early in my career that I psychologically needed for my self-confidence, even though my agent recommended I not take it. But I understood what I needed to continue, so to speak. So you'll find those moments too. You know, it's really, again, about, and I can't stress this enough, it's about knowing what you want, what is under your control about what you want, and being reasonable about what you can do to get there. And those sound like very boring things to study, but what I find is that the more that I think about when I'm not writing, like on with a firewall between career and writing, the more that I think about those things and really map it out, the happier I am. Because, for example, if something comes in that's like a request for an appearance or something, I already know where it fits in and what I've thought about with regard to my career. And so I don't have to dither, should I take this or not? I know immediately whether it's something that I want to do. And the same thing with book deals where people come to me or ask me for something in terms of fiction. And that's just very liberating to be able to think that, to already know.
That's, I think, so terrific. And I love that you emphasize that every writer's pathway is different.
It's different, yeah.
It's so important.
There's nothing, I once had a creative writing instructor who the one-on-one was me on this leather couch where I was sinking further and further into it, which was really bad because he was standing in front of me. And so he was more or less looming, though he wasn't meaning to be. And before I could say anything, he said, "Jeff, you're down there." And he meant down here career-wise, and I'm up here. But he literally was as well. He says, "And I have a Porsche, and you don't have a Porsche yet. But one day you'll be up here and you'll have a Porsche too. Any questions?" And ever since that moment where my answer was, well, I just really wanted to know what to work on in my writing, I've been very aware of trying to be of use to the student when I'm in that situation and not be the person giving some kind of weird general advice that maybe worked for me. I don't know what he was trying to say. Buy a Porsche, you'll be a successful writer. I don't know. But things like that has stuck with me. So I think sometimes when you're an instructor, you think about the great teachers you had. You also think about some of the not so great.
Yeah, that sounds like someone who is trying to go, hey, look at, I am driving a Porsche right now.
I'm not fond of those kinds of instructors at all.
No. Do you have any, you mentioned conferences, you mentioned talking with, going to different, I think, writing programs, et cetera. Do you have any other comments about conferences or writing programs or any of that kind of thing?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's so important to separate the instructor from the writer. So there's going to be writers that you love and they're just crap as instructors, and writers you don't like very much that are actually really good instructors. So sometimes it's good not to prejudge and try to get some word of mouth sense of whether a particular situation is good for you or not. I tend to go back to writing books from time to time. There's a great writing book called Revising Fiction that I mentioned in Wonder Book, where there are all these amazing examples from famous works of their first drafts or their, and then their final drafts, and sometimes even their revised final draft 20 years later when they redid the thing. And so I go back to those things because there's a lot of stuff you forget even after you've amassed a lot of technique just because you've been doing this a long time. So I take refresher courses from time to time in that. I am also always reading for the writing. Like it's good and bad. It's like when a book seduces me to the point where I'm not thinking about what the writing is doing and what the writer's trying to colonize me with, that means it's a pretty amazing book. But I study a lot of fiction, a lot of nonfiction, a lot of movies, thinking about what can I take out of this as well? What is it that I can learn here and apply? And sometimes what happens that I find fairly effective is if I see something that I think I can use, I'll just plug it into whatever I'm writing at the time in a particular scene, not because I'm going to leave it in there, but just to see how it works, a particular technique or anything else like that. The only other thing I would say is that for me, at least, and this is not true for everyone, at a certain point, I had to pare it down. Like there were only I needed to take some workshops. I needed to study writing initially in college with some particular mentors. And then I took a couple workshops, but after a while, I needed to pare it down just to some first readers I trusted and just do it on my own. Other people may need more social support than that, but there is a point at which I think it's important to pare down who is reading your work and giving you commentary, because at the end of the day, sometimes you just have to make a decision. And if you have too many voices in your head, you can't really make a decision because they often will be contradictory, because the fact of the matter is you can do things a million different ways and go in so many different directions. And it's scary to realize that, but it's true that so many stories and novels can have so many decision points where it can become completely different.
Oh, that's terrific. You remind me of Neil Gaiman saying that, when a reader says that something's wrong, 99% of the time they're right. When a reader tells you how to fix it, 99% of the time they're wrong. So,
well, that's why I was always back in the day before email, especially which tends to be more brief. I would get these long ass letters of rejection from editors. And they'd say, I'm sorry it took 6 months to get this. And I was like, no, what I really wanted was just, I'm not interested in a month, because the thing with editors too is that they can identify something's wrong, but they're usually reading lots of manuscripts. So their analysis is not really what you want, especially if they're not buying it. You just want to know whether they, if they want to buy it and they want edits, that's different. But yeah. So.
Well, this has been a terrific pleasure, and I will tell you that I would love to talk to you all night, but we do have students who have to go to class,
sure.
And professors who have to teach, and you have a life. You have to probably go out there and smear some bark butter on some trees.
I have to refill the owl feeder outside right now. No, I'm kidding.
I would not blink. You could tell me anything. So thank you so much.
Wildlife. Thank you very much, too. I appreciate it. That was a lot of fun.
Terrific. Thank you again. Take care.
Thanks, Jeff. It was really terrific. Thanks, Annie. Great job.
All right. Take care. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Your answers were incredible and mesmerizing.
Oh, thanks.